This presentation gives a brief overview of some weeding and watering tips. When we're considering weeding, if you think back to some earlier presentations that we gave, assuming you watched those, I talked about how you can prepare your garden in one of two ways. You can either prepare it through tilling, or you could do a no-till garden. So in a no-till space, your garden would largely be covered by mulch, such as leaves or grass clippings or wood chips or something like that. In the case of using mulch, mulch is great for many reasons, but one of the great things it does is it suppresses weeds. But it only does so if that mulch is thick enough. So a good rule of thumb to use when you're laying down mulch anywhere, whether you're tilling or you're just laying down mulch and not tilling at all, is that you don't want to be able to see the soil. As long as you can see the soil, then that means that the sunlight can get in there too, and if there's sunlight, that means that the weeds can grow up through it. So you usually want to make sure that that layer of mulch is about 4 inches thick. Here in this illustration on the bottom, you can see it says 3 to 5 inches. So, and those weeds just die from the lack of light. So that's great. Mulch is a great way to suppress weeds and to just have a totally weed-free garden. I love it. But assuming that you don't want to use mulch and you're tilling that space, then you just have a bunch of bare soil all throughout the year. And what you need to do in order to keep the weeds at bay is you need to continually be going out with some kind of a tool or by hand and making sure that you're beating back those weeds. One of the most effective ways to do this is with a really sharp hoe. You can see that one kind of pictured in here that's coming down from the top of the slide. That's commonly called a hula hoe or a stirrup hoe. And it's a really great tool because it's got a nice sharp edge on it. And a great recommendation if you're going to use a hoe like that is to get the weeds when they're small and young. It's far easier to weed a garden when the weeds are just less than an inch tall than it is after they're a foot tall. At that point, you're going to need to go in there with some big muscles and spend all day. Some other tips when you're weeding are to not weed in the same kind of conditions where you'd want to be transplanting. So, and I spoke about that in an earlier presentation as well, but maybe another way to put that is it's good to weed when the sun is hot and when it's dry outside. So once you've weeded those plants, they'll just die right away because they won't have any moisture and the sun will dry them out. Conversely, if it was a nice wet day and it's cloudy, you might weed some of those plants and shuffle them off to the side, but then they might just take root again because they've got a nice soft day to work with. So those are some weeding tips. I hope that's helpful. Now for some watering tips. Water obviously is a very important part of any garden. If you don't water it, your plants aren't going to be happy and healthy. So one of the common misunderstandings that people have, I think, when they first start growing vegetables is they want to water the plant, but it's quite the opposite. A good rule of thumb is that you want to water the soil, not the plant. Oftentimes wet leaves can lead to diseases in many vegetables. Now there are certain vegetables that don't mind being watered quite as much, like lettuce is an example of that, but even then you could still get kind of rotty and moldy in there. So in general, it's a good idea to just water the soil around the plant and not the plant itself. And another good rule is that it's often good to water a little bit regularly rather than dumping a lot of water all at once and then not watering for a week. There is a lot of information out there, probably on the internet or from the past, which would suggest just the opposite, that you should water deep and then not water for a long time and then water deeply again. The thought is that that's meant to encourage the roots to reach out more, but people understand today that it's actually better to feed them a little bit of water regularly. It's kind of like how you want to be watered as a person. You probably want to drink water every day rather than just 10 gallons in one day and then no water for the rest of the week. Another thing you want to consider is the size of the plant. Keep the soil moist around the seed or the root zone. So if you just planted a seed an inch down in the soil, you don't need to flush a ton of water in there. You just kind of need to regularly make sure that that top layer of soil is moist so that that seed can germinate. So again, that's going to require some regular watering. And again, if that plant starts to get really large, the root zone is starting to expand, you're going to want to keep that area moist as well. A good rule of thumb to go by is that you could water about a half gallon of water per week per square foot. So all vegetables require different amounts of water. So that's just kind of an approximation of what you could go by. But one of the best things you can do is just observe your plants and see what they need. And another thing you can do to check and see if you're watering enough is to just kind of feel the soil as well. So the illustration here is meant to show what you should be aiming for. So if you feel down and you take a little handful of soil and it's really crumbly and breaks apart in your hand, that's too dry. If it's soupy and muddy, that's too wet. But if you could take a handful of soil and form it into a ball, kind of like dough or Play-Doh, then that's just right. You want it to be moist, not muddy or crumbly. Another question that'll come in for watering is how should you water? There's obviously a lot of different ways that you can get water to your plants. You could use a can, you could use sprinklers, or you could use what's called drip irrigation. I just want to speak briefly about some of the pros and cons of some of these different ones. A watering can is very inexpensive, and maybe that's just the best route for you. Everybody can probably have access to some kind of a container that they could then go and water their plants with. So that's a plus. It also kind of gives you a more intimate connection with the plants so that you're really checking and making sure that things are going well. Sprinklers are great too because they're a more automated system. But one of the downsides about sprinklers is that they kind of liberally spread water all over the face of everything in the garden. So the downside to that is that you're getting water in between the plants where maybe you don't want there to be water. Then the only thing that you would be watering at that point would be potential or active weeds that are growing there. So then that's where drip irrigation comes into play. Drip irrigation is a more targeted approach. You can see that drip irrigation is in this illustration up here. It's just this small plastic tape or these little tubes that run, and they're connected to a hose that then pressurizes the system, and they have these tiny little emitters that drips out water at a constant rate. And that's great because you can make sure that those emitters are placed so that they're right at the base of each of your plants, and then that drip is just going to fill out the entire root zone right around your plant and feed just the plant but not the weeds. The other great thing about drip tape is that it's more conservative in water. When you're sprinkling water around with a sprinkler, it's covering everything, and a lot of that water is being lost due to evaporation. But with drip irrigation, it's sinking down deeper into the soil. If you want more information on that, you could go to a website like DripWorks, and they've got nice little kits that you can gather and purchase for starting your drip irrigation exploration.